Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this Friday morning session. I hope you're all still in high spirits. My name is Michalina Nadolna Peeters, and I'm a PhD fellow at the VUB here in Brussels at the university. Thank you so much for being with us for what I think is a very pivotal and timely topic, meaning we're going to talk about the deployment of AI in humanitarian action. Now, there are a lot of discussions about AI in general, about its risks, advantages, and all the other aspects. But when we talk about the deployment of AI in the humanitarian action, then arguably there comes an additional layer of difficulty. Humanitarian actions need to be guided by the principle of do no harm, of fairness, and we need to ensure that when this aid is being deployed, then the people to whom it goes are actually not worse off. So today we will zoom on these topics. We will talk about the specifics of AI. We'll talk about specific examples of how AI is deployed in humanitarian action. We'll also explore how AI is to be assessed from the perspective of data protection, but also whether there's a need to expand this assessment and look at it also from some other angles. Finally, but not least, we will dwell into the challenges posed by private and public partnerships. So today with me, I have 4 distinguished guests who kindly agreed to join us today. Welcome. Let me introduce them to you. First, we have Xavier Lareo López de Vergara. Apologies, sorry, Xavier. Xavier is a Technology and Security Officer at the Technology and Privacy Unit of the European Data Protection Supervisor, the EDPS. He's a member of the EDPS AI Task Force. He provides advice on technology development, and he specializes in biometric data processing, artificial intelligence, anonymization, online trafficking, and profiling. Welcome, Xavier.
Well, thank you.
Then with us, we have Catherine Lennman from the Swiss Federal Data Protection and Information Commissioner. Catherine is an expert in legal aspects of data protection, and she works on various dossiers in this area. She is a delegate for international affairs and Francophonie, and she represents the Swiss Federal Data Protection Information Commissioner at several international working groups. Notably, since last year, she is the chair of the working group on the role of personal data protection in international development aid, international humanitarian aid, and crisis management. Set up by the Global Privacy Assembly. She also contributed to the 2nd edition of the International Red Cross and Brussels Privacy Hub Handbook on Data Protection in Humanitarian Action. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you.
Then again, as a 3rd speaker with us, we have Júlia Zomignani Barboza. Júlia is a PhD fellow at the Fundamental Rights Center at VUB. She focuses her research on undesirable but unreturnable migrants. She also contributes to multiple research projects. Currently, she's working on a Horizon 2020 Rebuild project. She was also involved in the development of the mentioned handbook on data protection in humanitarian action. And welcome, Júlia. And last but not least, obviously, with us today, we have Aaron Martin. Aaron is a postdoctoral researcher at the Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology and Society, TILT for short. He focuses on humanitarian data governance within the Global Data Justice Project. Prior to joining Tilburg University, he's worked in the financial services sector, also at OECD, European Commission, and Vodafone Group. He also authored many articles on the deployment of technology in the humanitarian sector, notably a very interesting article on the deployment of blockchain. So welcome.
Thank you.
In terms of how this will work, each of our speakers will have 10 minutes for an intervention, followed by a Q&A with hopefully a very vivid participation from our audience. And without further ado, Xavier will start with his intervention. Xavier, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michalina. I think it is nearly impossible to avoid the hype around artificial intelligence. It seems that AI will save the world, so it was inevitable that someone thought that we could start saving the world by helping those most in need. Of course, AI comes with its own flavor of risk, and some of them become even more concerning in this context. Okay, I want to I want to be clear about one thing. I mean, I understand that personal data, the protection of personal data, is a fundamental right. However, and I don't pretend, or I don't intend that it's an absolute right. It must be considered in relation to its function in society and be balanced against other fundamental rights. I think that data protection can and must contribute to the ultimate objective of humanitarian action, safeguarding the life, integrity, and dignity of victims in humanitarian emergencies. Thus, privacy and data protection principles cannot be left aside when using AI in humanitarian aid, as they will increase humanitarian actors' accountability, ensure the trust of beneficiaries, and prevent the misuse of their most sensitive data. The first challenge for organizations dealing with humanitarian action is the fact that they have to deal with very different legal frameworks. The same AI system used in different countries will have to face these differences, and they will have to rely more often in general principles that can be translated into these specific legislations. This translation or transposition of principles into legal provisions will not always be easy. Machine learning is one of the most popular artificial intelligence technologies, also in humanitarian actions, and machine learning systems need training data. In many contexts, data subject consent is the most common valid legal ground for improving the machine learning system. So that's the legal basis that is generally used. However, in this specific context, when people are in distress and in need of humanitarian assistance, it is not usually the correct legal basis. So what I mean is that when you want to use the people's data, the personal data, for using machine learning, for obtaining a certain benefit for these people, then the public interest or maybe the vital interest of the person could be a valid legal basis, at least in the EU legal framework or in a similar legal framework. The problem comes when the same data, okay, the data that has been gathered to produce this benefit, is also used for a different purpose. And training the machine learning system in order to improve it, it's a different purpose. So then you need to rely on a different legal basis, and it will not always be easy to find such a legal basis. That's also the case because very often the humanitarian action organizations, they need to partner, or they used to partner with experts on AI. So they partner with big tech companies, or not so big tech, but companies which are experts on artificial intelligence. And of course, it's likely that these companies would like to use this data for other purposes, like training the models, and then use these models maybe on different contexts. So I would advise the lawyers of the humanitarian organizations to have a look to the contract agreements, to the partnerships, in order to make sure that everything is as it should be. Another example of artificial intelligence, in this case facial recognition, used for helping people is in 2018, the Delhi police announced that they would use facial recognition on 45,000 children living in children's homes. They allegedly identified around 3,000 of them in few days, but months later, the system was said to have a very low reliability, like around 2%. And 1 year later, it was said that it was only 1%. Similar systems have been also used to find missing people in China. And after the Hurricane Dorian destruction in 2019, a private company partnered with Caribbean public authorities and announced Find Me Bahamas, a project that planned to use facial recognition to help find thousands of still missing people. Even though the webpage is no longer available, and I have found no further news on the project. My intention while citing these examples is not to signal specific accuracy or bias issues on one or the other system, but to signal the difficulties of facial recognition when used in humanitarian context. Because some studies have proved that there is, in a state-of-the-art facial recognition system, there are demographic bias. There are bias that relate to gender, there are bias that relate to age, there are bias that relate to race or to ethnicity. So, for example, when the Delhi police states in their best practices document that their facial recognition system is used to find missing children, to provide near-match results for unidentified dead people, and to detect suspects in crowded places, then what I think is it's unlikely that the same system will work well in all the situations. When you think that most of the available training data for facial recognition is full of wild people, and it's unlikely that a system like that will work nicely in China or in India. In this context, I identify at least 3 challenges. One, ensuring that the training data used for facial recognition system is representative of a target population. A second one is that finding a legal basis to process minors' data, because if it could be easy, or it is easy, for the information that the parents provide for the search of the kid, you also need a legal basis in order to process the data of the kids which are in foster homes or in child homes under the public authorities' care. And finally, in order to have a system that is trained to distinguish properly children, you need children data, but most legal frameworks protect, and for good reasons, the children data. So it is not so easy to have a training data set that is representative. When dealing with accuracy, we need to consider that the false positives and false negatives, that is, when you miss a kid in this context, or when you wrongly identify a kid as a missing children that you're searching, okay, these 2 kinds of errors are related. And when you try to minimize one, you cannot minimize the other. So you have to carefully choose. So you need to make a decision, because errors in one sense or in the other have deep impact on people, in this case, on children and families. And about accessing public data for humanitarian AI use, there are a couple of projects that are interesting, at least. One of them is Project Fortis, developed by the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. This project uses AI technologies to create models for sentiment analysis and mood inference based on social media posting. Okay, the idea is that this system tries to help understanding what is happening in disaster areas or in conflict areas. The system provides quantitative insight into the topics, demographics, and indicators that drive key humanitarian conditions in targeted locations. A second project that is set up in Uganda, okay, is analyze public radio content to reveal a detailed picture of the priorities of Ugandans. In this project, machine learning performs a speech-to-text translation, while big data analytics create an automated search function on the radio content by topics of interest. Okay. The first challenge in this kind of systems is transparency. That personal data are publicly shared on the internet or on the radio does not mean that these personal data do not have any kind of protection. So you need to inform, and it's not easy to inform users in these cases. A second challenge is to find a legal basis that will allow you to use this personal data, because it's not easy. A third one will come from data retention, because many of these data are not interesting by themselves, but in an aggregated manner. And if you don't properly anonymize, or if you not delete this data as soon as you have obtained a result, the raw data could be used for different purposes. For example, to target specific people for their opinions or their concerns. Another challenge is also the security, because machine learning systems that are fed by publicly available data, they are more vulnerable than others to 2 types of attacks. One of them is data poisoning attack, which consists on deliberately introducing false data during the training stage, and the adversarial examples attack, where the attackers provide the machine learning system input that is deliberately designed to be misclassified. Someone with access to training data could add fake data to the system. In addition, an attacker could use social media botnet, for example, to massively inject fake messages during the training dataset collection or during the system operation. Fake accounts could start publishing messages full of anger in specific areas to force its classification as a dangerous enough to delay or divert the humanitarian action. So it is very important that we do some curation of the content that we feed to our system. I would also like to talk briefly about the challenges that anonymization could pose, because anonymization is a difficult task, and humanitarian action is driven by the needs of collective and not of specific individuals, but it needs, when dealing with artificial intelligence, the data of individuals. So, for example, there is a project in Turkey that uses AI to understand the refugee integration in the country. It is very important in this case because the input data for this analysis is the anonymized call detail records provided by a telecom operator, Turk Telecom. There are papers, very sound scientific papers like Unique in the Crowd or Trajectory Recover from Ash, that state the difficulties of really anonymization location data and lowering the re-identification threshold. So it's very important that anonymization is done very thoroughly and the re-identification risk is noticed. And I would like to close by saying that I am convinced that AI can help humanitarian action, and I do not pretend that the rights to data protection always prevail over the fundamental rights. But I think that we need to work all together to win these challenges and to overcome them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Xavier. I mean, so many interesting points, starting with basically the question whether AI can save the world, summarizing the risks, mentioning some of the risks that are there, but also ending on this very important note that AI can actually help, but we need to control it. So thank you so much. Now we'll move to Catherine. Over to you.
Yes, thank you, Michalina. So in my short presentation, I will focus on the use of AI in humanitarian action through the lenses of data protection law and give you some information on the work of the data protection authorities worldwide. So we all know that personal data can be used in ways that has value to society. Data can help humanitarian groups to better assess the challenging situation they are looking to address and to maximize their impact on the ground. But while personal data has a value in helping society, we must not forget that it remains personal. There is a person behind every dash and dot, and this brings responsibility. Firstly, of course, it brings the legal responsibilities, from international standards like the Convention 108 of the Council of Europe, to national legislation, or to an IO's own guidelines and ethical standards. And at the core of those responsibilities is a commitment to taking accountability for the risk that is created by data processing and translating the do no harm imperative into a data protection response. And that is especially important when a country's first experience of a particular innovation or a particular approach to data comes from a humanitarian group. The ethical choices that are set out in that first approach can set a precedent for the use of data. So the second responsibility that comes with the use of data is one of trust. People need to have confidence that their personal data will be used fairly and lawfully, and that contributes to the trust factor. So to address the specific topic of today's panel, we have just heard from Xavier that AI tech can be very useful in the humanitarian sector. For instance, to help finding persons separated from their families following a humanitarian emergency, or identifying categories of people in need of aid. Xavier mentioned the question of facial recognition. So facial recognition tools could help identify and locate missing children by anticipating facial changes by aging, for instance. But despite its potential, we also know that AI presents challenges and risks, like, are the training data representative of the reality the algorithm is meant to assess? Are there important decisions being made on the basis of AI-driven analysis with impact on the life of individuals? Or how can a human really understand, let alone challenge, how the AI come to a particular conclusion? So the role of a data protection authority is to protect people's privacy rights while encouraging innovation that could help society. As Xavier said, finding the balance is not always easy and is a problem best approached with combined wisdom of the international data protection community. The Global Privacy Assembly plays an important role in bringing this community together. Indeed, it brings together over 130 data protection authorities from over 80 countries in the world, and several observers, amongst which, for instance, the RCRC or IOM. So in 2018, the Global Privacy Assembly decided to tackle the AI topic and adopted a declaration on ethics and data protection in artificial intelligence, which is available on the GPA website. In this document, the conference has endorsed 6 guiding principles as its core value to preserve human rights in the development of AI. So I will shortly present you those 6 principles. The first principle is the principle of fairness. This means that you have to consider the individual's reasonable expectation, as well as the potential impact on both individuals, but also the collective impact on groups and on society at large. Second principle is ongoing attention and vigilance. There needs to be clear responsibility, accountability, and governance. Third principle, transparency and intelligibility. It is crucial to provide clear and understandable information regarding AI use and of its effects. Fourth, we have ethics by design approach. So not only privacy, but also ethics. This could mean, for example, to assess and to document the expected impacts on individuals and society at the beginning of an AI project, but also for all the relevant developments during its entire life cycle. The fifth principle is individual empowerment. The exercise of individuals' rights should be encouraged. So here we think about the right to information, the right to access, and so on, but also promoting those rights through education and awareness campaigns. And last but not least, the sixth principle is that unlawful biases or discrimination should be reduced and mitigated. So I know all of this might sound pretty theoretical to most of you and somewhat difficult to put into practice. And that is one of the reasons why the Global Privacy Assembly has created a permanent working group that is working on translating those principles into practical guidance. So the work is ongoing, so I have nothing to show you now, but it's an ongoing work. Since 2015, the global privacy work has also focused on the cooperation with humanitarian actors. This has led to a number of achievements, including the development and publication of 2 amazing handbooks Michalina mentioned at the beginning of our panel. The second edition was just published last summer and addresses emerging and complex issues like AI. So I highly encourage you to go read them if you haven't done yet so. They're available for free on the ICRC webpage. So the Global Privacy Assembly wants to pursue its work in this specific field and continue to offer support to the crucial role that humanitarian groups play. And that is why last October, the Swiss Federal Data Protection proposed a resolution on the role of personal data protection in international development aid, international humanitarian aid, and crisis management. So this resolution was unanimously accepted by the Global Privacy Assembly and has led to the creation of a working group I am happy to be chairing. One of the objectives of the group is to meet the demand for cooperation in further development of guidance expressed by international humanitarian actors. Another important objective is to help to make the handbooks published by the RCRC and VIUB more practical with stronger examples. We are aware that humanitarians in the field are thirsty for actionable tools to help them make better decisions in protecting personal data. There is one last initiative I'd like to mention, which is the Digitarium. So this is a global forum set up by the RCRC, which aims to discuss and debate digital transformation within the humanitarian sector. It provides a space where humanitarian, diplomatic, academic, data protection experts, and technology practitioners can meet to collaborate in order to find local and global solutions to today's digital dilemmas. So if you're interested, do not hesitate to join the club. I would like to conclude by seizing this opportunity to ask all of you to continue the dialogue with the Global Privacy Assembly. Do not hesitate to contact me with your questions or suggestions, because I am strongly convinced that keeping an open dialogue and sharing expertise between all the different parties is essential. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Very, very clear and very informative presentation. I think the call for cooperation and for further debate is a very important one. Thank you so much. And now we move to Júlia. Over to you.
Thank you, Michalina, and thank you for my co-panelists for starting this debate. So I'm going to try and build on what's already been said. So basically, when we're talking about applying AI to the humanitarian sector, we have all the challenges that come with using AI in the first place, some of which Xavier has already presented to us. And then we have all the data protection challenges that Catherine has mentioned. But as Michalina said in the introduction to this panel, we need to go beyond that and also look at humanitarian principles that apply to all actors engaging in humanitarian action. So this is a complex set of principles, but as was already mentioned before, I guess there is an overarching principle, which is the do no harm. And this basically means that those engaging in humanitarian action should ensure that their own actions don't bring harm to those that they're trying to assist. And to bring some examples of how using AI can clash with these principles, I am going to use, as was already mentioned before, an example that is facial recognition. So I worked on a paper with two amazing colleagues of mine, Lina Yasmantite and Lawrence Diver. Do check them out. So we worked on what will be the challenges in using AI-based facial recognition to restoring family link services. This is hypothetical. It's not being applied right now by humanitarian actors, but many humanitarian actors, especially those in the Red Cross and Red Crescent movements, do engage in restoring family linked services. So basically, they work to reunite families that got separated while running from conflicts or due to natural disasters. And one of the ways they do that in the Red Cross or Red Crescent movement is the Trace the Face sort of project. Basically, people who got separated from their families can upload a photo of themselves in a website, and the family members that are looking for them can manually go through that database of photos to try and search for the family members. Well, considering the advances in facial recognition, and also, as Xavier already mentioned, the fact that it's already being used to identify missing people in other settings, I think it's it's definitely something that will be explored, how to make this current manual search automated so that the process is faster and maybe more efficient and more families can be reunited. But again, there are already lots of AI questionings and data protection questionings of this use, but I'm going to look at it through the humanitarian principles sort of lens, let's say. So basically, as Xavier was mentioning, one of the challenges is that a lot of the systems are, say, biased. So they perform better on white men. This is known because, again, AI is mostly developed right now in Western countries, and that's the training data that they're used to. So, of course, when we're looking at families that are trying to reunite, they're not all going to be represented by white men. You're going to have members of specific minorities or different ethnicities. So indeed, the system may not perform the same with all populations. And this is a challenge with the principle of impartiality. So in the humanitarian sector, impartiality means that you cannot discriminate. Let's see, it's not exactly the word, but let's say you cannot discriminate, as in you cannot choose to provide aid to someone based on their gender or their ethnic origins or the national origins. You can only discriminate based on need. So if someone has a greater need, then yes, you can give them priority. That was the word I was looking for, prioritize. You can prioritize them in your assistance, but you cannot prioritize based on anything else. And we're talking about people that are looking for the family members. Their needs are exactly the same. So you cannot give priority to a specific group, which is why a system that doesn't perform the same with all populations will be very difficult to comply with this principle. And then another challenge that was mentioned by Xavier is the fact that most humanitarian organizations don't develop their own AI systems. And so they will have to either get an off-the-shelf solution or, as was mentioned, partner with big tech or with another company. And Aaron will further develop on partnerships. But as Xavier was mentioning, there is an issue with one training. So basically, this tech company may have a system that performs better in certain populations, and they will look at this big database of photos of people from different ethnicities, many new data, and say, well, this is a great opportunity, but you're going to train our system, and it's going to be the most accurate system in the market. And while on the one hand, for the humanitarian organization, this may meet their humanitarian goal, oh, it's going to be better, and it's going to make it easier for all populations to meet family members. On the other hand, the big tech or the partner may be seeing this as a commercial opportunity and saying, well, now I can advertise, oh, look, my algorithm is the best. It works on all population, it's been trained on minority groups. And as Xavier was mentioning, this has a big problem of informed consent. You're using data of vulnerable populations in a humanitarian setting. It will be very difficult to have informed consent. And not only that, it begs the questions of humanitarian experimentation. You are using this data of someone who has very little chances to object. And then going a bit further is, well, once you have, say, a more accurate system, how is that going to be used? So say now this company commercializes it. And I think most people here already heard the discussions about in China of how face recognition systems may be used to identify members of a specific minority group, such as the Uyghurs. And indeed, certain tech companies in China, when applying for patents on face recognition systems, actually had mentioned that their systems may be used to identify certain ethnicities. And if you have a system that has been trained on multiple ethnicities and is actually accurate to do that, how can you ensure that then the companies are not going to sell it to governments or any harmful actors who will use that to target certain populations, which goes directly against the do no harm principle. And then lastly, we come to accountability. I mean, there are many other principles that we could discuss, but just to close it down a little bit. So when we're talking about humanitarian action, the Code of Conduct for the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Movement and NGOs in disaster relief mentions that humanitarian organizations are accountable to 1, those who they are aiding, and 2, those who give them the resources to provide aid, so donors. In practice, donors are mainly governments, and again, just like companies may have different interests than humanitarian organizations, governments as well may have different interests. So say a government thinks, oh, we're starting family links, that's great, I definitely want to get on board, we're going to assist, we're going to invest, we're going to put money in so that the best AI system can be developed. But in return, we want access to this whole database of photos of people looking for the family members. And we want to use this new accurate system to search all the photos to see if there's anyone in there who our law enforcement authorities are looking for, who is a suspected terrorist. And of course, we know that in some situations, a terrorist is basically a political opponent, right? So this is some of the dilemmas that humanitarian organizations need to handle, which is, well, you need donors, you need a way to finance your action, but how do you say balance this dilemma of being accountable for those you aid, but also for donors? And lastly, so I want to close by reinforcing something that Michalina sort of said at the beginning, which is that when we're looking at humanitarian action, well, when we're applying any new technology, especially those that can have important impacts for data subjects' rights, we should do a data protection impact assessment beforehand to evaluate the risks as well as the positive impacts that technology can have. But when we're doing that in the humanitarian sector, we should not only look at the data protection impacts, but also at the humanitarian principles. So we do an enforced and say expanded data protection and impact assessment. And only when that assessment shows that the deployment of the technology can be done complying with data protection and, very importantly, complying with the humanitarian principles, only then you can practically look at deploying that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a very clear presentation, but you mentioned so many interesting points, especially this, the need to balance these conflicting interests. I presume this will be something also that Aaron will talk about, but this is really something that is very clear in how AI is being deployed in humanitarian action. So we'll definitely come back to this in Q&As. In the meantime, Aaron, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here. First, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate today. I'm sad not to be able to just be in the room with you all, but hopefully next year that'll be possible. So today, my intervention is based on ongoing research within the ERC Global Data Justice Project based at the Tilburg Law School. I'd like to acknowledge a few folks, my colleagues Linda Taylor, Gargi Sharma, and Morad Goodwin in particular, with whom I've been examining questions of data governance and partnership within the humanitarian sector for the past year or so. I'd also like to thank the ICRC for its collaboration on our research, UNOCHA's Center for Humanitarian Data for their ongoing engagement with our project, and last but not least, the UNHCR Innovation Service for sharing their experiences with me, particularly about the challenges that AI poses to humanitarianism. All right, so we've talked a lot about sort of the use of AI and analytics within the humanitarian sector. Sort of clear to everyone that this is a critical topic, especially if we consider some of the harsh realities facing many humanitarian organizations. Júlia just noted this sort of funding crisis that looms over the sector. So there's this pressure increasingly to work more efficiently, often under tightening budgets, that is to do more with less. We see this more and more these days, especially. Now, one perceived way of achieving these efficiencies is through partnerships with the private sector, including technology firms, importantly for today. These partnerships increasingly involve the exchange of humanitarian data with private actors, often to inform AI models with different applications. And Xavier noted in his intervention some of the important applications that he's encountered in his work. But there are in fact different kinds of partnership between the private and humanitarian sectors that we can explore in this space. So first is sort of simple financial contributions, right? Either through a transfer of funds from a commercial partner to a humanitarian organization for a specific deliverable, or by directly sponsoring some humanitarian activity. Next is this kind of technology provision that we've been talking about. So this is where a commercial partner will offer its technology for free in some cases, or at a subsidized price for use by the humanitarian organization. Now, a famous case of this kind of arrangement is the analytics partnership between the UN World Food Programme and Palantir, which I'll return to shortly. Third is in-kind technical advice. This is where a private company will second a technical expert to support a humanitarian organization in their use of AI or data for different purposes. And this addresses a specific need around the lack of AI expertise within the sector, with the idea being that the private sector has a wealth of knowledge and skills that it can share through a partnership with the firm. Fourth is joint technology development, which involves a private sector in-kind support to collaboratively develop bespoke technology solutions with humanitarian organizations. And fifth is sort of a kind of public-private data collaboration, which makes data or insights that are held by a commercial actor available to humanitarian organizations or as a public good, so publicly available. Now, as I just mentioned, there's been some high-profile and dare I say controversial partnerships in this space, which have forced some rather uncomfortable discussion and reflection among humanitarian partners. In 2019, the UN World Food Programme and Palantir revealed a strategic partnership to help the food program streamline the delivery of food and cash-based assistance using Palantir's Foundry software platform. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with Palantir, I think most people are aware of what the company is and what it does. Its analytics platforms are most famous for their defense, intelligence, and security applications, which has made its expansion into other sectors, including public health within the sort of coronavirus pandemic, but also humanitarian affairs, rather uneasy. Now, we still don't know very much about the specifics of the relationship between the food program and Palantir, even 2 years later, which says a lot about the lack of transparency in this area. What we do know, according to the press release, was that the original agreement includes the transfer of expertise from Palantir to the food program, as well as the provision to the food program of a perennial license for the Foundry software. So the idea here is that they won't be forced to buy it after the partnership expires. Now, the specific partnership in this case is valued at 45 million US dollars. But Palantir is offering its services and expertise to the food program for free for 5 years. And now, of course, this begs the question of what's in it for Palantir, right? What's the motivation for a company like Palantir to create such a high-profile, extensive partnership with the food program? And I'll come back to this in a bit. Now, importantly, in terms of data protection and data governance, the food program has said that Palantir doesn't have access to any beneficiary data, as it maintains strict control over its systems, and that the food program retains full control over data, the analysis, and any derivative work. So this, again, sort of speaks to some of the concerns that Xabier raised around what happens to the insights and the models that are derived from the use of AI within these partnerships. But this data protection-based defense hasn't deterred criticism of the relationship, which questions the ethics involved in this kind of partnership. So as a relative newcomer to the humanitarian space, I've only been looking at this area for a few years now. I've come to deeply appreciate what the core humanitarian principles mean to the critical work that humanitarians undertake. So, I mean, this is really what separates the humanitarian sector from the private sector and other sectors. Catherine discussed 6 principles that ought to be considered when developing AI for humanitarian use, and Júlia has expertly explained do no harm and impartiality. But in the context of a discussion on partnerships and partnerships around AI and data, we need to explore some additional principles, which are fundamental to the humanitarian enterprise. Now, a quick refresher of some of these. One is humanity, right? That human suffering must be addressed wherever it's found. The purpose of humanitarian action is to protect life and health and ensure the respect for human beings. A second one is neutrality. The humanitarian actors must not take sides in hostilities or engage in controversies of a political, racial, religious, or ideological nature. Júlia mentioned impartiality, as I just said, but I think a third one, which is super relevant to this conversation, is operational independence. The idea that humanitarian action must be autonomous from the political, economic, military, or other objectives that any actor may hold with regard to areas where humanitarian action is being implemented. Now here we already begin to see how partnerships with organizations like Palantir complicate the practice of these esteemed principles, these fundamental principles to humanitarian action. Now you hear a lot about shared value in the literature on public-private partnership and in discussions with humanitarian organizations who are seeking out commercial partners. This is the idea that business strategy can be designed to solve social issues profitably by leveraging the resources and innovation of the private sector to create new solutions to some of society's most pressing issues. Now, if we take the humanitarian principle seriously, then I believe we need to critically assess this notion of shared value as the humanitarian sector in particular continues its embrace with the technology sector, especially those companies with questionable track records and dubious business models. Now, I'd like to close my intervention with a few questions for critical reflection. First, do values always need to align in a partnership of this sort, or is it enough that there is no misalignment or divergence of values between partners? So in other words, for example, where a private actor's business model does not concern humanitarian issues, at least its activities don't undermine the humanitarian cause. That's one idea. Now, the second question for critical reflection is, what does it mean for private sector partners to derive benefit from humanitarian action? Can the private sector collaborate with humanitarian actors without a business case? What does this mean? Third, what kinds of risks do humanitarians take on when they engage with commercial collaborators and vice versa? In particular, how do we ensure that data partnerships are not exploited to transfer risk from private firms to humanitarian partners or, more importantly, their beneficiaries? And fourth, how important is transparency in humanitarian action as opposed to other domains? Should partnership agreements, including, of course, those for the development and use of AI and analytics, be made public by default? And is it possible to report transparently, on every aspect of a partnership that involves data and AI models, given that the modes of processing and analyzing data may be proprietary? Thank you again for your time. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I have to say, some of the questions that you posed were some of the questions that I already wanted to pose, so which is a natural starter for a discussion. I guess a very interesting topic to zoom in on is indeed the conflict between the competing interests that you and Júlia and Xavier and all of you basically mentioned in some way or another. I mean, obviously we have this conflict between some of the hidden, perhaps, interests of the private entities that want to help, the question of what is the benefits that they get, and then also the tasks of the humanitarian actors. So my question is, I thought that the question you, Aaron, posed was, so do the values need to align, or is misalignment sufficient? I think it's a brilliant question to ask. It goes to deep down to the question of, should there be any breaks on that type of partnerships? Should there be any red lines that cannot be crossed? And if so, where do we draw that line? I guess, Aaron, you could answer, but it's a question to all of you.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great question. I'm not sure I have a convincing answer. It's something that I'm actively thinking about. Are there red lines within, in particular, the use of AI in the humanitarian space? I'm hoping to have more convincing answers in a few months' time. I think as a community, we can agree on certain applications which are clearly off limits, and I think some of the other panelists have noted some particularly problematic uses of AI in the sector. But I wonder if there's anything particular to humanitarian intervention which in some respects raises the bar and makes for clear red lines or obvious use cases which are very much off limits.
Mm-hmm. If I may?
Yes, of course.
I mean, of course, I don't have an answer straight away, but my first impulse would be to treat this like a kind of risk assessment issue. So, I mean, it will depend on how much misaligned are the objectives of the humanitarian organization and the partner. And of course, the red lines must be drawn by the humanitarian organization, but depending on the gap in between or the misalignment in between these objectives, I would say that it will be necessary to agree on more and more controls. So, I mean, if you cannot trust at all your partner, then don't go with it. But if you can trust to a certain extent this partner, then do add some controls. I mean, and these controls could be legal, so you have legal agreements saying you can do this, you cannot do that, but you can also have organizational or technical controls. So the data are going to be stored in our premises, so we control who accesses the data, so we know if you are accessing the data for purposes that are not the ones that are envisioned in our agreement. So a risk-based approach, I would say.
If I may?
Of course.
Yeah, I would like to echo what my two co-panelists just said. So I would underline the importance of organizations taking a risk-based approach to AI. So there should be an assessment of the risk to the rights and freedoms of data subjects that may arise in the circumstances. And it should be followed by the identification and implementation of appropriate technical and organizational measures to mitigate those risks. And on this topic, careful consideration needs to be given to the controllership status of each party involved in the use, provision, and development of AI. And as Aaron said, well, we do know which cases are off limits, but there's this gray area we need to find answers to. Thank you.
Thank you. Júlia, would you also like to express your opinion?
I mean, I feel like most of everything has already been said, at least the core, because of course we could go on for hours, but basically, as I was saying before, indeed, and here I would second Xavier and Catherine, there should be a previous assessment to ensure that there is no humanitarian experimentation. So before you deploy, you assess, okay, so what are the risks? And in this assessment, you also have to consider the zero option. So it's, well, what do we currently do right now? What are the current risks without the technology? And what are the risks that will come? And also the advantages that will come with the technology. And indeed, if there is a risk that it will bring harm to beneficiaries, then it's a no-go. But indeed, it's not like not using technology is also perfect. There are also risks that come with that. There are also operational issues that are complicated. Personal data is sometimes shared on a notepad that gets forgotten somewhere else, and that is also something that needs to be considered. But both options have to be brought into this evaluation, and when there is a risk, it's a clear no. But indeed, it is a bit of a gray area of how do you implement the technology. You can also not be an absolute ban, because then you also get a bit behind, and again, it's not like no technology has no risks. But basically, yeah, I definitely agree that there should be a previous assessment before it's even considered, before the partnership officially starts. Let's say you really need to look at what risks this could bring to beneficiaries.
And then obviously on the flip side, then we would have the accountability. But as you mentioned, understood a little bit more broadly, so not only on the basis of the data protection accountability, but more broadly also to the donors and to the receivers, as in to the individuals who receive the help.
Yeah, and sorry, just to make a follow-up point. You know, we talk a lot about facial recognition in particular as a particular application of AI in this space, and of course, there's countless risks with the use of facial recognition for surveillance purposes, whether it's in the humanitarian context or elsewhere. We should be careful about sort of calling for outright bans or moratoria on the use of those technologies, because I'm thinking of, in particular, ICRC, I think, has a very interesting program where it's trying to use facial recognition to reunite families. So where there's a lost family member for whom a photo is possessed, and you can use that information to try to relocate someone that's gone missing. And I think that's actually a very positive application of this sort of technology. And they've actually been quite thoughtful about how to do this in a sort of privacy-friendly way. And you know, I guess my point here is that we should acknowledge that there are very often like multiple uses of technology, some of which may be quite nefarious and malicious, but in other cases might actually have real value and sort of can do a lot of good.
That's a very good point. We are getting some questions from the audience. Let me read the first question to you. Are vulnerable subjects of the use of AI in the humanitarian sector involved at all in these discussions and democratic oversight apart from informing them about their individual rights? And considering these are vulnerable data subjects, is there any support and education organized so they can exercise their rights? That links to one of the points that I think Catherine raised, that education, not only the existence of the rights, but also educating individuals that they need to have, that they have these rights is the core. Would you care to address the question?
So yeah, that's one topic we addressed with our CFOB in the Humanitarian Handbook. So where we say that the organization should have procedures and system into place to ensure that individuals can exercise their rights. And going with this, they should also employ the principle of data protection by design and default, so collecting the minimum data necessary. But we are aware that in this humanitarian context, the exercise of these rights might be limited in certain circumstances. And one thing we are working on is to allow to more practical tools to apply those handbooks. So that's one thing we are going to be working on.
All right, thank you. Any other voices from our speakers?
If I can just weigh in a little bit. So basically, in the big bulk of set of humanitarian principles, one of the principles is that humanitarian action should build on local capacity, so that you shouldn't just come with a perfect solution. You should really engage with the population that you're trying to assist, to see what their needs are and really respond to what they need and not what you think they need. And I think, of course, data protection should be brought into this initiatives. I think it is a bit tricky in part because it depends on the culture, it depends on the knowledge of the population that we're working with. In some cases, they might already have a previous knowledge. In other, as Catherine was saying, you do need to have this sort of education efforts and working together. But it is definitely something that it is a humanitarian principle, and humanitarian organizations should aim at involving them as well in developing the program. And this is a lot some of the arguments for cash-based transfer. Instead of giving them specific food or clothes, you let them decide what they need, so you transfer cash directly. But then we loop again, for example, some cash-based transfers are based on mobile transferring. So you do it through a mobile phone, and then you need a specific provider. And then again, I don't know how much people are involved in how well they didn't really choose the phone provider to receive the cash. So it's, again, another duality. It's like, well, you're already empowering them in a way of saying, well, we're going to transfer cash, and you can choose how to prioritize that. But for it to be feasible for the organization, we need to do it through intermediaries, and sometimes that also implies processing data. But it should definitely, I think it's something organizations are already working on, but it's very challenging in practice.
If I may add,
of course,
I think it's quite complex to have an ex ante input from vulnerable people, because when you're trying to help people that are in need of humanitarian aid, I mean, it is unlikely that they will have time or the will or the the capacity at that moment to provide you input. But I've not been involved in any of these projects personally. I just read of them or meet people who worked on them. I guess that what should be done, and I guess that's being done, is it's exposed. So provide feedback. So to which extent what we did to try to help you really help you. So apart from, of course, having your own KPIs or your own indicators, you talk to the people and you try to know if they really felt that the way you helped them was the best possible way. And I think that's something that could be done. Probably it's being done. I don't know.
I think these voices very much link with one of the questions from the audience that we got, which is asking, we have a member of the audience asking, noting basically that it is not uncommon that refugees, missing family members, or others in need do not have a stable phone number or physical or email address or proper documentation for that matter. And so the question is, where these subjects are these individuals are subject to facial recognition or other forms of AI, what could be the solution for stronger user empowerment? How could data subjects exercise their rights at later stages of the processing? This is a very practical question.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, so you mean my data is being processed because I'm in a vulnerable situation, but I want to have something to say in the further processing of my data later on. So no, did I got it
It's
right?
about, yes, I think so. I think the broader spirit is to talk about how individuals can enforce their rights, considering their limited presence, email, lack of postal address, lack of phone. So how can they actually enforce it? Because I mean, I could simply just go online and write an email, but how can individuals who are in vulnerable situations, how can they enforce their rights? How can we ensure that they are involved in control of their data when their data is being processed?
I would say that, I mean, humanitarian organizations that fostered the use of certain tools should be also helping these people to exercise their rights, because of course I can fully understand that if you are the victim of a hurricane or a flood, you maybe have nothing. I mean, not that you don't even have food. So how are you supposed to exercise filling a form and sending it to the US or to Europe or whatever? So I guess that it's a humanitarian organization's duty also to take care of this and help them. I mean, they need to be independent, so they need to do whatever they want. But if they want to exercise their rights, the humanitarian organization should help them, because I think that they are on the ground and they also know to which extent the project has processed this data, and probably because they were involved in the project since the very beginning, they know exactly which are the risks and how to better help the vulnerable people to exercise their rights. So I would say that that's the first answer.
Yeah, and to follow up on this, I mean, it's a hard problem, and of course, there's always going to be I think, a significant portion of the population which doesn't have the means or capacity to access digital channels, for example, to exercise data subject rights. But I think there's this shift within the sector in terms of promoting connectivity and access to mobile, whereby I think there's a hope that over time, the mobile phone will become the sort of entry point into this world of data and rights, and that we can increasingly sort of rely on mobile phones and connectivity to engage with humanitarian organizations, to exercise some of these very practical concerns around rights and so forth. Of course, it's not a perfect solution, and you can't assume that everyone's going to have a mobile and access to reliable connectivity. But I think there is a sort of gradual shift in that direction, because the phone is sort of seen as a lifeline, as increasingly a sort of a core component to humanitarian protection and aid. So there is a trend there. I'm not sure it's a perfect solution by any means.
All right, thank you so much. Unless one of you wants to take the floor, I will move to next question from the audience. All right, so next question that we have goes back to impact assessments. I will read it out. I would like to hear more about the privacy impact assessments that Júlia mentioned. You mentioned at the end. When exactly should they take place? It's in cases such as those described by Aaron. So should they be carried out, for instance, by the private company, by Palantir, or by the public authorities before they call a private company? The question is mainly for Júlia and Catherine, but I guess everybody can chip in.
Well, if I can start,
please.
I would say definitely not by the private company. It should ideally be done by the humanitarian actors. Of course, we know it really depends on which humanitarian organization we're talking about. The ICRC, for example, has a data protection office with very qualified people, but that is not the case for everyone engaging in humanitarian action. So, of course, it might be hard to have the right expertise to conduct a very thorough impact assessment. But, of course, this is another area where you can partner. For example, the Brussels Privacy Hub has already worked at the VUB, that also worked in the Handbook on Data Protection and Humanitarian Action, for those who don't know. But I think everyone here does. Okay, anyway, sorry for the little advertising. But the Brussels Privacy Hub has already worked with humanitarian organizations on conducting an impact assessment because, of course, it's an area of expertise. And this is basically to also explain to the humanitarian actor, well, what exactly are you planning and about which moment this happens? For example, if you're already considering like, oh, okay, this can be improved by facial recognition, or this could be improved by, say, a tracing, just like COVID, tracing people so we can avoid pandemics or epidemics. When you start considering it, that's when you should start looking at the assessment. But of course, the assessment is a long process. You can't just consider something in abstract. You have to have an idea of what is the technology that you're going to be applied, because you also have to assess the specific technology. You can't assess an idea. So it is a long process that should follow until the implementation of the actual technology. And of course, if at any part of it you see a no-go, then you stop. Not necessarily stop, but for example, if the no-go is the technology, but the idea is still relevant, then you might look and maybe partnering with a different company, or just installing a different system, or using local servers, or I'm giving very abstract examples, I'm sorry. But I'm hoping this might sort of give some guidelines of how this happens. And of course, you might need to have expertise that you will engage to conduct this impact assessment, because not every organization will have the capacity of doing them by themselves. But I definitely don't think they should delegate this to their commercial partners, because as I was mentioning, it is not just a basic data protection assessment or compliance with the law. They also need to expand this assessment to how is this going to affect beneficiaries, and this is not something that humanitarian organizations can delegate.
Thank you so much. Catherine?
Yeah, I can only echo what Júlia just said. In those for a few minutes, she said almost everything. I would also advise people to have a look at the handbook of the ICRC and VUB on the impact assessments. There are a few helpful questions that are in this handbook, and yeah, I am perfectly agree on the fact that it needs to be undertaken by the humanitarian organizations and not the private sector, and it has to be done before starting the data collection.
If I may, just follow up very quickly. I think this is an excellent question. Completely agree with what's been said so far. I mean, I think it's important that we reflect on the priorities of the humanitarian sector and specific organizations. And like, as Júlia mentioned, there are still some pretty significant humanitarian organizations that don't have data protection offices. I mean, they're in the process of recruiting and building out capacity. But, you know, it's one thing to have the handbook. It's amazing. You know, sort of organizational policies around data protection and data management are also important, but you need that internal capacity and expertise on data protection and sort of understanding risks around data as a fundamental step in all of this. And the fact that certain organizations are rushing to embrace and adopt pretty sophisticated technology, often through partnership, without having that infrastructure in place for data protection oversight, I think for me says a lot and probably is cause for concern and reflection. And I just want to make one more point and I'll stop. So the interesting thing about the Palantir relationship is, from a data protection perspective, like pure data protection compliance, I think that actually checks out. You know, they've been careful about how they scope the project, what data is being used. There are other concerns that of course emerge. So I think we need to be careful not to hang our hat only on the data protection risk assessment as we think through what these partnerships and uses of technology mean. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I think we still have a few minutes for one last question from the audience, which loops back to what Aaron, you mentioned. So what are the benefits for private companies to partner? Is what they do really for free. And so the question is, do you think the question of trading data in humanitarian organizations, so private actors, partnerships, whether these can be compared to the problem of free services, for instance, social platforms, but which, however, are subject to users' consent to process their personal data for commercial purposes? And then if you think that this can be compared, could they be could very targeted solutions like the EU response for political advertising be considered as a solution for the humanitarian domain? Or rather, would a general prohibition of any secondary use of data processed in the humanitarian context be a better solution? Aaron?
I'm not sure I follow the question. I apologize.
I think it's a very long one. I think the bottom line is really the idea of how do we combat this fake free nature of the services, and how do we control the secondary use of the data that is being collected by the private entities?
I'll address the first question. I think that's a question for decision makers within the humanitarian sector, within organizations that are taking services and software for free, and I'm sure they understand that there are risks involved in sort of the kind of partnership that I've described. But I also feel for them as well, because they have limited budgets. They want to use technology in productive ways, and it's hard to say no to something $45 million service offering that's given for free. So it's a really hard question. I don't know how we police secondary uses besides being honest about what we do with data and not sharing it on and selling it on. And I hope that most organizations are doing that. But these are hard questions, I will say.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. There are multiple hard questions still on the table, but I think we really did identify the potential that AI holds for the humanitarian sector, but we also highlighted that so many of the risks remain, and there really is a need for action. So let me thank you so much for your participation, for your interventions, and for sharing with your views. And thank you so much to the audience for joining us for this panel. I hope that you will enjoy the rest of the panels today, and hopefully see you at some other time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.